Hello, Clorin here, reading part 2 of Slenderotica called How Slender His Tentacles. Slenderotica is by Jen Harker. You could buy her wonderful Slenderotica series off of the Kindle store for $6.99. I do not recommend it. However, that is up to you if you would like to purchase erotica of Slender Man. Without further ado, 3 days had passed since Marla had fled from the abandoned school in the middle of the woods. 3 days since she'd driven, half mad with fright, from the woods to the nearby town of Kinderwood, checking into this cut-rate motel and locking herself away. 3 days since she entered the room, not leaving, surviving on water from the sink and a box of granola bars. 3 days since she'd left Gerald behind with that thing. The job had seemed choice at first. Spending the summer interning for a well-known paranormal blogger, earning a few journalism credits, getting paid a nice stipend, and all for holding the camera and taking turns driving on what was turning out to be a months-long road trip. She hadn't actually paid a lot of attention to the research the older man was doing, but he seemed honestly to believe in this tall, slender man that he was investigating. Gerald had said that it was a creature of pure memetics, whatever that meant, something to do with the internet. They traveled together to some dump of a burnt-out school in the middle of nowhere. Marla had found it creepy as hell, but Gerald was insistent on checking it out. He said that he'd traced the roots of the Slender Man phenomena to the township, and that the school was the site of one of the earliest confirmed sightings. It was in the basement that the tall man found them. Marla had glimpsed at first a pale face. There had been no face, among the jumbled and fire-damaged labyrinth of furniture. She'd only had a quick look, but that had been enough to chill her to the core, paralyzing her with an instinctive primal terror. She watched, unable to follow, as Gerald stumbled off through the crowded basement after it, quickly disappearing from sight. She started to follow, turning to switch off her camera, and there it was, the tall man, a dark shape looming towards her. Blind panic took over, and the next thing she knew, she was at the truck, fumbling with her keys, hopping in and driving away. Until she'd reached the Kinderwood town limits, it had never even occurred to her to go back for Gerald. She didn't. For 3 days she had half hoped, half dreaded that he'd call her cell phone, but for 3 days it had remained silent. At first, the silence unnerved her, seeming too big, too present, too vast, and she turned on the television to drown it out, but soon found that the voices and laughter and jingles coming from the speakers were so artificial, so grating, so fake, that the noise was emptier than the silence it had replaced. The newscaster's eyes seemed to follow her with a hungry intensity, and she saw tentacled shadows in every sitcom set. Even the laugh tracks had taken on a cruel edge, and she knew that their malice was directed at her. The characters' mouths seemed to open too wide, showing too many teeth, and their eyes seemed dead, flat, soulless. After that, she kept the television off. She spent most of each day in a corner of the bed, wrapped up in blankets, staring at the closet door. Somehow she'd convinced herself that when the Slender Man came for her, and he would, she just knew it, that he'd come through the closet, or from under the bed. She kept her feet away from the edge, just in case. Once a day she'd call the front desk and authorize another day's payment on the expense card that her boss had given her. But other than that, she avoided the phone. She knew he was there in the static between words. She knew he would find her. There was no plan, not really, beyond hide under the blankets and wait. Wait for what? For Gerald to contact her? For the card's credit line to run out? For the tall man to find her? She didn't know. She was just going to wait. Then she ran out of granola bars. She'd have to take a risk. She'd have to risk a trip to the grocery store. It was late afternoon when she finally scraped up the courage to leave, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt that hadn't been washed in almost a week, the motel parking lot empty save for Gerald's truck. The noise it made starting up was shocking after days of silence, and she realized that the motel was also dead silent. She didn't hear any other cars, birds, or insects. She briefly considered shutting off the engine to confirm this, but decided that the utter silence was worse than not knowing. She shifted the truck into gear, pulled out into the parking lot, and onto Kinderwood's main street. It was a small town, and all the businesses along the street were local. Mom-and-pop hardware stores, touristy little knick-knack kiosks, family-style diners. They were all well lit, all were open, but she didn't see any people inside of any of them. and she didn't pass any other cars on the road. If it wasn't for the electricity, she'd have found it easy to believe that the world had ended within the last few days, and she just hadn't noticed. The grocery store was more modern than she would have expected, but its fluorescent lighting only seemed to heighten her apprehension. Soft music was playing over the sound system, and the automatic doors opened readily enough, but she didn't see anyone inside when she entered. No customers, no cashiers, no stock boys, nobody. It was unnerving, to say the least. She grabbed a cart from the corral and started pushing it down the aisles, grabbing what supplies she thought necessary for an indefinite stay in the motel: a case of soda, a box of crackers, some more granola bars, and some dry cereal. No milk, though. The room didn't have a fridge in it, but she picked up the cereal that she could snack on dry. On impulse, she grabbed a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter, then a bunch of bananas to make things healthy. Grocery shopping was not her forte. She slowed as she passed another cart in the produce aisle, the first sign of life she'd seen since leaving her motel room. It was half full, but there wasn't anyone around to push it, as if the customer who'd been using it had just suddenly vanished, or been taken. Marla grabbed a package of fudge cookies out of it and continued on. All the registers had "Sorry, we're closed" signs on them, but the self-checkout machines were operational. She briefly considered just leaving without paying, but they probably had cameras or something. Maybe there was a staff meeting going on in the back. Yeah, maybe. They were all in the meeting. The sky was a lot darker than it had been when she left, and Marla saw the heavy clouds had rolled in while she was shopping. The wind was blowing fiercely, the edges of her flannel shirt flapping, and it had gotten colder. She quickly loaded all her groceries into the cab of the truck, gave the cart a good shove towards the corral, and it rolled towards it, then veered sharply away, rolling to the middle of the lot and then stopping, and got into the driver's side just as the first cold drops of rain began to splatter on the windshield. Someone had stuck a pale yellow sticky note to the wheel. 109 Folsom Street. An address, written in blocky blue pen. It looked like Gerald's handwriting. Her hands began to tremble. Gerald was alive. He'd put the note in her car, but hadn't stuck around to talk to her, to tell her what was going on. What the fuck is this shit? Terrified, but suddenly desperate to see a familiar face, she threw her car into drive and began looking for Folsom Street. The house was an older one, brick, with wooden trim and columns in a colonial Georgian style, in a dubious state of repair. The lights were on, shining bright yellow against the darkness of the storm clouds overhead. The curtains were drawn, and there were no cars in the driveway. There were 2 floors and 2 chimneys. The rain was intermittent, as Marla jumped out of the car and padded up to the front door, but grew heavier as she rang the doorbell. Nobody came to answer, so she knocked. Still not receiving an answer, and now growing soaked, she tried the knob. The door opened easily. Marla hurried inside, and found herself in a sparsely appointed foyer. The kitchen ahead was dark, as was the family room to her left, but the foyer light and a few sconces on the stairs leading up to the second floor provided a warm, almost orange glow. Her flannel shirt was soaked cold to her skin, so she peeled it off and hung it on one of the hooks in the hall, leaving her in a soaked white cotton tank top. There was a jacket there, hanging alongside her shirt. Gerald's green canvas jacket. "Gerald?" she said. "Hello?" Silence was her only reply. She fumbled with the foyer's light switches. The first flickered the overhead lights on and off. The second controlled the stairs lights, but the other 2 didn't seem to do anything. She slid her hand around the corner into the living room, but didn't feel a switch, and repeated the process in the kitchen. She eyed the shadows in both rooms nervously, and decided to take the stairs to the second floor. "Gerald?" The steps creaked loudly under her every hesitant step. The landing at the top of the stairs was lit, as was the hall leading between the doors to what she assumed were bedrooms. The 4 to either side were closed tightly, and she didn't bother trying to see if they were unlocked. The door at the end of the hall was open a crack, and she could see a faint light coming from within. Something about it, the chipped white paint of the door, the utter silence in the house, even the slight crack of the open door, like a closet, filled her with an almost religious dread. Still, she found herself walking towards it, drawn to it by an imp of the perverse, a self-destructive impulse. The back of her mind knew she would find something horrible within. She couldn't turn away. Marla pushed the door open. The bedroom inside was simply furnished: a single bed, a desk with a lamp providing the room's slight illumination, and a dark figure standing in front of the window facing away from her. Gerald? Time seemed to slow to a trickle as he turned. There was nothing wrong with Gerald. He looked normal, but the blank expression on his face was somehow terrifying. She found herself struggling to turn, to run, but it was as if the air was made out of a thick syrup, and her limbs didn't really want to obey her. Intellectually, she knew that there was no reason to flee from her boss, but the impulse was almost all-consuming, and her inability to actually do so left her feeling helpless. He seemed to almost to drift towards her in a slow motion, warm hands on her bare shoulders igniting a sudden wave of desire that she was totally unprepared for. The feeling of his warm hands on her cold flesh, the strength behind his grip, the strange, dream-like state she found herself in, it all contributed to the spark of a powerful arousal that sat in the base of her spine. Her apprehension washed away, replaced by the relief and gratitude in seeing a familiar face. She tried to speak, but couldn't, as he pulled her against his warmth. His strong fingers slid up to her forearms to caress her face, and she melted into his tenderness. Marlowe's head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, but she didn't have to think. She let her body react, felt her goose flesh rise, felt the warmth grow in her chest, and between her legs as his dry lips found hers. She'd never seen her boss in a sexual way. He was a good deal older than she was, but handsome in a distinguished and masculine way. She pressed herself against the hardness of his body, distinctly noting the pleasant, earthy, almost piney scent of his bodily musk. His fingers slid through her hair, along her scalp, fingernails dragging across her flesh, raising more goose flesh. She tilted her head back, letting his lips surround her, flicking her tongue out into his mouth with an echoing sigh. Gerald's hand drifted down from her hair, caressing her cheek, fingers trailing past her jaw and neck to her chest. His large hand cupped her breasts through her wet tank top, the warmth from his palm hardening her nipple. She felt her heart beat faster at the contact, and half collapsed, trembling, into him. He laid her gently on the stiff mattress of the room's bed, half laying alongside her, running his hands under her shirt and across her belly. She pulled the tank top off over her head, and he unfastened her bra. Hands seemed to be everywhere, covering her breasts, caressing her between the legs through her jeans, stroking her lips, pressing it against her ass, unbuttoning her fly. She was lost in the moment, all sense of sequence lost, everything happening to her at once. He slipped a finger between her lips, even as he slid her wet jeans down her hips, a hand down the front of her panties, pressing her most sensitive spots as it moved between her legs. Her eyes were half-lidded, and he seemed but a shadow above her, her fingers laced behind his neck. She sucked gently on the finger between her lips, and then craned forward to kiss his brow, his cheek, his chin, but couldn't seem to find his lips, almost as if he was turning his face from her without moving his head. Something was wrong. A small spark of panic surfaced above her lust, and she opened her eyes again, gazing at the blank face above her. The blank, no face. It was the Slender Man, the hands she felt, his lithe tentacles, holding her to the bed, caressing her, pinning her down. Her small sliver of panic turned to an abject terror, and the sudden rush of adrenaline chased away the dreamlike quality of her surroundings, and she struggled to push him away, to scream, but the sound was muffled as the tentacle in her mouth slipped into her throat. His scent, his musky, earthy, pine scent, seemed to increase to overpowering, and the tentacle between her legs, the tentacle circling her breast, drove her fear away. This was right. This was good. This was inevitable. There was no reason to struggle. And besides, she wanted this. She wanted him. Whatever purpose the Slender Man had, whatever reason he wanted her, he wanted her. She was his. The small spark of panic was extinguished as she gave in to him, her will his for whatever purpose he wanted. She bucked her hips as his tentacle penetrated her, entering her slickness easily. Marla moaned around the tentacle in her mouth as it fucked her, as his other tentacles caressed her breasts, as the tentacle in her mouth filled her throat. The tentacles were thicker than any man she ever had, but gentler, able to rub against her insides in just that right way, and she felt her pleasure mounting in a way that she could scarcely imagine. Her hands drifted back to the blankness where her face would have been an immortal man, caressing the curiously textureless skin, feeling only slight bumps where her nose and lips would be, small divots where the eyes would be. The Slender Man, the tall man, he was alien beyond alien, flesh but not flesh, and she wanted him to fill her. "Fuck me," she said. "Make me yours." His only response was to curl his tentacles around her thighs, lifting her hips off the bed, as another tendril probed at her ass. She'd never let a man sodomize her before, but he was oh so much more than the flesh that he wore. She wanted to be his entirely, utterly. She felt the squirming tip of the tentacle slipping into her rectum, groaning loudly as it writhed and wriggled. She felt full, stuffed, complete, the tentacles in her mouth, pussy, and anus thrusting into her with a steady and undeniable rhythm. Each brought its own pleasure in a way that defied simple biology, a spiritual warmth, a glowing sense of utility and purpose. The warmth spread from her ass and her pussy up her spine to her heart, where it met the tingle in her lips and transformed into a holy fire as it spread into her brain. As the first in a chain of orgasms racked her body, it blasted away the lingering shreds of her sanity, scouring from her any sense of ego. There was no more fear, no more pain, no more terror, no more Marla. She was part of him now, as much as any one of his tentacles. She lay in the room, bare skin sheen highlighted by the pale light of the desk lamp, gathering her strength. Her eyes were closed, but she was beyond sleep now. The tall man had fucked that out of her along with all of her other human weaknesses, hollowed her out and replaced what he had taken with his own powerful essence. She wasn't his. She was him, an extension of his will. Her eyes flickered open in the dimness. He had work for her. Well, that was part 2 of Slenderotica, How Slender His Tentacles. I apologize for my stuttering, but what can I do? I'll get better with time. Anyway, I hope you guys keep up. Don't forget to look for part 1, and part 3 will be coming up shortly. Have a good night.